I want to welcome everyone to the Business Roundtable Conference Center this afternoon, and I'm delighted to see so many people here and so many interested in a topic that's a little bit offbeat, I suppose, for many, but something I happen to be very interested in. And it certainly is a topic that every CEO in America is pretty familiar with, because all of them, as you'll hear from some outstanding ones today, as you know, running an enterprise, you have to be concerned about the structure and the operations and the efficiency of an organization. So our conference on transforming government for the 21st century today is exactly that, about the federal government. And so we are delighted to not only be a sponsor, but also have a co-sponsor in Governing Magazine for today's event. And Dennis McKenna's the CEO of Governing. He's here today, right? Where's Dennis? He's right over there. Thank you, Dennis, for the support. You got a number of your team that are here, and we're going to hear a lot from Kathleen Robinette, who's the Executive Vice President of eRepublic, the parent company for Governing, and she's going to be moderating our panels today. And so we want to welcome the Governing team. I think you know, or many of you do, but if you don't, I'm John Engler, President of the Business Roundtable, and the Roundtable itself is an association of chief executive officers of many of America's top companies. These are companies led by CEOs, and they generate more than $7 trillion in annual revenues, employ nearly 16 million people. So most of these companies are pretty complex global operations, virtually all of them headquartered here, although there are a few members headquartered in other nations. And these are companies that have had to experience and survive by restructuring, reducing, and transforming themselves, and when necessary. But I think today's business reality is that it's almost constantly necessary. And so the pressure for change can come from technology, from a marketplace, the realities of a very competitive, increasingly competitive global marketplace, from mergers and acquisitions, from a whole host of reasons. The federal government rarely does very much of this. Duplication in programs, pretty widespread. Last year, GAO reported that Congress had acted on less than 40% of the recommendations about how to reduce waste. For example, 6 federal departments and agencies focus primarily on business and trade. 5 deal with housing. More than a dozen are involved in food safety. When they wanted to talk about regulations on fracking and the unconventional extraction of shale gas, they found more than 11 agencies might have a role to play. Now, facing sequestration, across-the-board cuts, it really does present a great opportunity. And there are ways to streamline government and at the same time make it more effective. So clearly a win-win opportunity. But I think there's an obstacle that we all know about. No president since President Reagan's administration has had the authority to reorganize government, to reorganize the executive branch. And we believe strongly at the Roundtable that a president should have the ability to restructure the branch of government that he's in charge of. A CEO needs that. And executives, whether they're in business or government, I think should enjoy that authority. Now, CEOs can reevaluate and restructure. In the private sector, they can do that for some of the reasons I cited, but you do it to meet changing circumstances or customer needs, market needs. And we're going to hear from 4 CEOs who've got experience both with their own companies and in all cases actually dealing with the federal government. We're going to hear from a former governor, a big city mayor on their approach toward effective, efficient management. We've got a former Secretary of HUD and a one-time Comptroller General with us today. So we've got a star-studded lineup. We're going to close with Senator Mark Pryor of Arkansas, Senator Tom Coburn of Oklahoma, and these are 2 gentlemen in the United States Senate, those buildings right over there, who are going to play a key role if we're going to have some success. And often these issues are not at all related to partisanship. It's really one branch squaring off against another branch, executive versus legislative or vice versa. And we're delighted that President Obama's administration is very well represented today by an outstanding public official, somebody who's been part of the federal government for more than a decade, probably closer actually to 2 decades, Danny, and that's Danny Werfel, the federal controller of the Office of Management and Budget. And the Obama administration is, I think, following in a tradition of focusing on better management of the federal government. President Clinton had the Reinventing Government initiative. There were a series of reforms under the president who touted himself as the first MBA president, President George W. Bush, and some of the benchmarks and the online goal setting that was done. And last year, many of us here at the roundtable worked with Jeff Seitz, who's been the acting director of OMB, on a proposal to give the president reorganization authority along the lines of what I've mentioned. There were other issues that actually probably sunk that, but related to which parts of, which agencies are ending up in Commerce. But nonetheless, the intent was, I think, on the mark. So let me, without any further delay, bring up our first speaker, Danny Werfel, who was confirmed as OMB controller in October of 2009. And you've got his bio in your packets, but I want to just cite this passage because it's sort of impressive. As controller, he's responsible for coordinating OMB's efforts to initiate government-wide improvements in all areas of financial management, including financial reporting, improper payments, real property management, financial accounting standards, grants management, and financial systems. That's kind of a job and a half, and that's just the beginning of his responsibilities. He's had a long and distinguished career before his presidential appointment, before he left the security of the Federal Civil Service and moved over to take an appointment. He's been through and experienced personally a number of the challenges and battles of dealing with government transformation. So I think we can both learn from him and certainly appreciate the fact that he comes here on behalf of the administration. So, ladies and gentlemen, the controller of the Department of Management and Budget of OMB, Danny Werfel. Danny, welcome.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you to the Business Roundtable for having me here today. I'm going to keep my remarks relatively brief, throw out some thoughts and ideas that hopefully will frame the rest of your session today and give folks some things to think about, and then open it up to questions, which is the part of the presentation which I usually enjoy the most. Let me start by offering a critique that I've heard of government before. It's a very high level, with not a lot of depth involved critique. But let me throw it out there. And the critique is that we too often see our government leaders at signing ceremonies, and everybody shows up to the signing ceremony. But those same leaders are not there with the same verve and same attention when we leave those signing ceremonies and we get to the tougher job of implementation. Because every time you're at a signing ceremony, you should know that behind that signing ceremony is a lot of work that needs to be done, a lot of execution. And if we're not focused on it, that's really likely where the more important aspect of our work on behalf of the taxpayer is at. So as the governor mentioned, I have this unusual experience of having been a career civil servant at OMB, and then making the transition to the political more recently in the past 4 years. I've been at OMB for more than 15 years now, and if you look back in terms of what the government has dealt with over the past 15 years, there are some very interesting, diverse, and unique challenges, and OMB has been at the center of a lot of it, not always aware, the public is aware of how central we are, but I know a lot of people in this room are aware of how central we are in the execution of the federal government. Anyway, I think I might be a good person, therefore, to weigh in on this critique of whether our leaders are not focused enough on execution, or what happens during the execution phase. And what I've seen over my 15 years at OMB is that government transformations tend to move slowly. And let me give you some examples. Automation. As the government has moved to automate from paper to electronics and manual processes to technology-driven processes, we have victories, but we are nowhere near where we could be in terms of that transformation, and that transformation tends to be slowed down. I have this one memory back in the late 1990s where we were arguing over whether to convert some of the more critical forms in government to electronic, and the lawyers were arguing back and forth about whether we could accept a digital signature or not. This was kind of this novel concept. It takes the government an unusually long period of time to embrace that novelty of a digital signature. And that's kind of one of the things that we need to think about in terms of how we can be more transformative. And in some cases, a risk aversion can emerge that we have to confront and deal with. Another example of a real estate transformation that tends to move slowly is real estate. We are making progress in consolidating and shrinking our real estate footprint. But when you look across the United States right now and you see our real estate footprint, we have offices in just about every county in America. We have a lot of overlap and duplication of that real estate footprint. And the reality is when you look at that footprint, you say that's the way that footprint emerged, because that's the way the government was serving its citizenry back in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and even earlier than that. And now we no longer serve our citizens in a bricks and mortar way, yet our real estate transformation is lagging behind. And why is that? And let's talk a little bit about that. And then this whole concept of leveraging shared services and common infrastructure. One of the great emergent efficiencies that we're seeing in industry is, cloud and shared technology and shared services, service-oriented architectures, all these things that mean that we're buying once and using many, and that we're gaining economies of scale and skill by rethinking how we do a lot of our common functions. And believe me, across government, there's a lot of common denominator functions that could work in a shared environment but are yet to. Now, that doesn't mean that we haven't started, and that doesn't mean that I couldn't point to pockets of success of shared services, but the pace of which we adopt these shared services across the board. And these things, whether it's real estate, whether it's automation, whether it's shared services, and I can go into many different areas, they have with them significant opportunity for operational efficiency, which leads into and encourages more productivity across the entire program and across the entire agency. So they're critically important opportunities. If we don't avail ourselves of them, they're slowing us down. Why are we not making these transformations as effectively and as quickly as we could? And so another way of wording the question is, if you have an aggressive vision to reshape and resize government, what are some of the inflection points that impede progress? Well, there's no way in 10 minutes I can go through all of those points. But let me focus on two of them before I open up to questions. The first, I think Governor Engler was referring to it. The first one I want to focus on is what I call very safely competing stakeholder interests. That's the politically safe way of talking about the parochial elements of our work. Whether it's reorganization of government, eliminating and downsizing our programs, the question I surfaced earlier about real estate consolidation, things like personnel reform, these are some of what I've just outlined there: reorg, program elimination, real estate, and personnel reform. Those are some of the big ticket areas where transforming our approach could have an enormous return on investment for the way government operates and bring it into the 21st century more effectively. But in each of those areas, our progress has been historically stunted, and that's not new. I think this dates back multiple administrations. This dates back decades. Our progress is stunted by the fact that we run into the parochial elements of our process here in Washington, D.C., and how the government works. Academically, you step back and you look at our government. Obviously, I'm the first person to sing from the mountaintops that we live in the best country in the world, and and our Constitution has endured, our political process has endured, and I've heard the president say time and time again, not just this president but previous presidents, that we will endure and be successful, and I believe in that. But that doesn't mean we can't perfect our process and figure out where we are having moments of inertia and how to overcome them. And in this, and I'm not going to get into, I don't have time to get into the specific examples. I think we all know them. But I just before the session, I was talking to the governor about, you've got one building here and one building there, and we don't need both, and why can't we combine them? Well, because somebody cares about this building and somebody cares about that building, whether it's a member of Congress or a mayor or a governor or a local business or the community itself. And typically, when the federal government decides we're going to do something with one of those buildings, all those interests converge, and it can be enormously complex and slow the process down. So the question becomes, not just for that, but when we're trying to get rid of a program that might have a title that people are concerned about getting rid of a program with that title, or a particular member of Congress has an interest in it, or a stakeholder group, how do we break those types of that type of gridlock? And I think one of the things that we need to think about is the use of independent mechanisms, and how do we drive the use of independent mechanisms smartly. So I'll use the example of BRAC as an independent mechanism. I'm not here to defend BRAC and say, I'm not going to articulate whether it was a smashing success or a failure or not, but it's an important historical program that needs to be evaluated, because basically the concept was there was a sense amongst the many players and stakeholders that downsizing our military base footprint was going to run into all these issues, and we needed a game changer if we were going to make real progress. We needed to do something different, an independent commission that didn't answer to either political party once they were appointed, and a fast-track process on the Hill, and an up or down vote. So the ingredients were there, and again, there could be a massive critique of BRAC, and I'm sure many of the points would be valid. What I think we need to ask is, and in particular around the operations of government, some things that should not necessarily be political. They're about running our organizations most effectively for the larger macro of government efficiency. Should we be looking to these independent mechanisms more? And I think there's dangers in over-relying on independent mechanisms. I also think they represent an opportunity. It's something that should be evaluated by a group like the Business Roundtable to help us understand how to right-size and shape how we use these things. And in particular, the case is going to be much stronger where you see a large positive return on investments that are never reaching their fruition because of these issues. And at some point, the hope is that we break through and understand that we no longer can wait for the process to correct itself. We have to come in and help the process correct itself. So that's one. Competing stakeholder interests tends to slow us down. How do we overcome that? The second thing I'll talk about is just a lesson learned over. I mentioned that it's been an interesting 15 years. And one of the reasons is because the government has dealt with a very diverse and interesting array of both crises and urgent operational imperatives. When I first got to government in 1997, we were just getting our handle on Y2K, as an example. And I remember how the government coordinated itself to get ready for that. Obviously, shortly after that, we had 9/11, the government's response to Katrina, the financial meltdown, the oil spill, more recently preparing for the risks of government shutdown and debt limit issues. The past 15 years have been replete with these moments in time of unusual set of circumstances, or extraordinary circumstances, and an urgency to figure out how to deal with them. And for me personally, I've been involved in all of them in some degree. The one that I haven't mentioned yet, which wasn't a crisis per se, but was an operational imperative, was the implementation of the Recovery Act, which going back to February 2009 when that bill was enacted, it had enormous amounts of pressure for success and very tight deadlines, and a nationwide data system need to be stood up, and it was a very complex program involving hundreds and hundreds of programs, significant financial and programmatic risks, and And we learned a lot during that urgency. One of the big things that I learned during that urgency was in this situation, and I think we have to figure out why, the folks that were in the signing ceremony walked right from the signing ceremony into the into the control center. There were a lot of boots on the ground. I remember early in the Recovery Act implementation being astonished as I saw the president, the vice president, the secretaries, the DepSecs, and those secretaries and DepSecs top people in every meeting. Not the president every meeting, but every meeting was at the highest level of agency engagement. And that was so significant to the success point. And that urgency not only brought the best and brightest and most accountable and people with the most power to the table, it also, because of the timing, created a lot of opportunities for collaboration across agencies and across governments between state and federal. And it also had us doing business differently. Not cutting corners per se, but if the normal roadmap was going to take 6 months to do a regulation or do something like that, we said, how can we condense that into 6 weeks while still getting input and engagement and having people feel like all of their rights were understood, and how do we, and so there were moments in time where we were driving through those competing stakeholder issues in real time and in different ways. And so the second lesson learned here, I think, is we need to figure out how to channel that type of urgency and use these moments that the government has had, these responses to these crises or these operational imperatives, as laboratories for what went right. Why were we able to do it so much quicker? Why were we able to do it with the right people in the room? What created that type of accountability, and how do we set those priorities? So as we look ahead to the next 4 years, I think in the first term of this administration, the groundwork has been laid for a lot of high ROI opportunities. Reorg, the president has been very vocal on reorganizing the government. Strategic sourcing, combining the government's purchasing power so that we're making smarter investments. I mentioned shared service. I mentioned co-location. There's a whole innovation agenda. We have a digital strategies agenda. How do we get into the app world? We're getting there. There's an app for that. Well, that government at some point in time is going to be playing in the sphere in a much more significant way than we are today. The question is, how long is it going to take us to get there? How expensive is it going to be? And how smart are we going to be about what priorities we take in leveraging the information age to be more citizen-friendly, to raise our customer service level? I think the business community can play a key role in all of that. I think there's 2 key ways. One, advocating for the importance of government modernization. That call for urgency, that need to overcome parochial politics. There's got to be a voice coming that modernizing our government has to be a priority. We can't move slowly on it, and we can't be bogged down in the normal politics of the day because the issues are too important to our economy and to our citizenry. I think the business community can play a huge role there. And then there are mechanisms like the President's Management Advisory Board and other areas where business leaders can actually weigh in on substance. How do we solve these problems? How are we taking lessons learned from the corporate environment and bringing them home to actually roll up our sleeves and solve problems together? And I think that has to be a dominant element of government modernization going forward. I think we're just getting started on that terrain. So with that, let me pause and open it up to any thoughts, reflections, or questions. Yes?
You mentioned the command center, how you got a lot of attention.
Yes.
On implementing the Recovery Act. What are the set of circumstances that would generate the demand for a command center for such a large transformation as described?
Well, I'll tell you, it's a good question. It starts with the president or the CEO in this case. This was a major priority. Let's go back to 2009. It was the first. Obviously, the passage of the Recovery Act was the most significant thing that was happening at the beginning of the first term of an administration. It was the first major management and executive challenge of the executive branch of the president's administration. And it was fraught with potential risk and with a lot of promises. It's going to be the most transparent law ever. It's going to be, the money's going to go out more quickly than it has before to state and local government. And we're going to do it with no fraud or error. There was a lot of challenge that was put out there. And the whole world was watching. For me, in my world back then, I went from mistakes that are made by me and my team being caught in GovExec to Good Morning America overnight. And if we made a mistake, they did a whole Stephen Colbert segment on a mistake we made during the Recovery Act. And that's when I knew that this was more on the national consciousness, and that creates that type of accountability. The key is, and this is the really tough question, is how do you channel that in places where we're more in ordinary circumstances, but we still need to get our job done? How do you, and I think that's in part about building priorities, but it's also about changing the culture of government so that the secretaries are getting out of the signing ceremonies and into the control rooms, and there's a different expectation that we set on our government leaders on implementation and effectiveness and how we measure the success of a government leader. But we probably spend a whole day on that topic. Other questions or thoughts? Yes, in the back.
Has anybody looked at the impact of the lack of modernization within the federal government, how it may be reflected in rulemaking? Because I think when you mentioned about technology and electronic signature, that same kind of 19th century thinking,
yeah.
How it gets reflected in the rulemaking in terms of its impact on business and its ability to utilize modern technology.
It's an interesting question. I want to bring that one back to OMB because I know that the president and OMB have had a major emphasis on what we call regulatory look back, and because we want to make sure that we're not resting on the existing body of regulations as being the smartest and most efficient, because things change, time change, industry changes, and we need to get rid of quote unquote dumb regulations where we can. And there's a lot's been done on that regulatory look back. But in terms of a specific subcomponent of that around where regulations are stunting government modernization, I think that's a very interesting. Yep.
Then having that sort of bias against modernization embedded in the rules that we have to work with.
Well, that's another interesting angle. I think that's worth analysis within a regulatory look back. Yes.
About 70% of the $80+ billion in IT spends maintaining legacy systems, which are pretty much obsolete and old and the like. And yet the agencies aren't doing the operational assessments necessary to see whether continuing to maintain these old systems is warranted. You talked about the challenge of implementation. What is necessary to get agencies to do what they're already supposed to be doing in this regard to get modern technology into the government?
Well, you're touching on a very big area. The challenge that I think we have, it feeds on itself, and I don't want to be the guy who's only giving problems and no solutions, but let me start with a different problem statement than what you just articulated, which is that because we don't have a strong track record in government in making major system modernizations, there's these incidental costs. It becomes expensive, not just in real budget dollars, but in the cultural and emotional toll that it takes on federal agencies. They've been there before. They've seen what these large IT modernizations do, and many of them have failed, and some of them that have not failed have not performed in a way that was originally envisioned. And then we obviously have some success stories. And fixing this issue has been a major priority of the administration. I think we've made progress. But the reality is that you need a very good environment and a healthy environment to drive modernization. And you need to have a sense that there are low-risk, low-cost ways of modernizing our systems. You need the right people with the right skill sets to manage these IT projects effectively. And you need budget and resources to understand. Sometimes short-term investments at a higher level can lead to those efficiencies in the long run, and that's part of kind of a larger budget framework. Are we making the right early investments for the longer-term efficiencies? And I think what you're seeing right now is a combination of all those factors, having agencies rely on their legacy systems more. I've also been pushing agencies to look at their legacy systems and figure out how to get more out of them as necessary. Because one of the mistakes we make in the IT world is we sometimes get a little bit too excited about how many business requirements we're going to build in. And I often tell this analogy of, it sounds like a joke. It's like two CFOs walk into a room, and there are two ATM machines at the end of the room. One is old and green screen and has DOS based and has coffee stains all over it. And the one right next to it is modern. It's playing a song, a video, it's touch screen. But both CFOs go in and they both get their $40 and they walk out. We didn't really need the modern one to get the $40. And I've tried to make sure agencies are thinking about their priorities on IT modernization, using that analogy, because in a scarce resource environment, we've got to make the right decisions, not just about which systems to modernize, but when we modernize, what do we really need these systems to do? Because one of the historical realities of why our IT modernizations don't go so well is because we overbuy in terms of what requirements we need. There was another question here. Yes?
Yes. Will the administration be pushing again for the reorganization authority, and are you optimistic now that the election's over that Congress will enact it?
Well, we have reorg authority that was included and transmitted to Congress. So they have our bill. And I think the president remains very, very interested in, the way I said it, is reshaping and resizing government to be more modern and effective. And from my understanding, and I'm on the front line of this, working for the president on this point, every tool that we can use to do that should be at our disposal. And certainly the president's authority to reorganize government would be a very critical tool that the president himself has spoken publicly about and felt strongly enough to transmit a piece of legislation to Congress. I've testified on the issue before the Senate and made the points that I'm making here today, which is we need the tools to get the job done. I think that's one of the key ones. And yes?
You referenced, I forget exactly what your term was, but the BRAC, I think you called them external, something like, you called them external frameworks or something like that. Are there any other things?
Independent mechanisms.
Independent mechanisms. I like that. I'm going to use that somewhere. Yeah, an independent mechanism. So are there any other independent mechanisms that you could think of that Congress could help you do your job? I mean, I know reorg authority would be some, but something like Senator Warner has a regulatory budget, for example, that would put in place some kind of a framework that would help you create a more efficient government. What are the kinds of independent mechanisms that you think of that would be most helpful in the efficiency transformation process?
Well, I think there's a lot of variations on it. We have some today that maybe could be leveraged differently. We have inspector generals, for example, and GAO to a certain degree that can, and GAO's doing its job. I mean, it's surfacing the tough questions for public view. Now, some of this is about making things more transparent, getting out there, and maybe we need to do even more of it, getting out there what the opportunities that the federal government's not availing themselves of because of a particular parochial interest. And I don't expect this to go from 0 to 100 overnight, but you fight every battle the best you can to try to drive government efficiency. And I think transparency is key to that. Transparency around what the opportunity is and what some of the interests are that are preventing that opportunity. And a lot of the interests are legitimate, but they overlap with one another and they prevent any decision from going forward. And so, I think you want to lean into, when I say independent mechanism, it could be an IG, it could be a separate commission. Then people usually take the baton from that and say, once you've got this separate commission, who it's okay. They could get yelled at by either political party, the president, Congress. Their job is not tied to those criticisms. Their job is tied to a particular mission that they've been given at the outset. I think those can be very useful, but we have to be economical in how we use them. You can't have an independent commission pop up for every single problem. That was my point. It was, what are the top priorities? Where are the top ROI that if we can infuse this, we can make some progress? That's the type of question I think we need and present to Congress in a way that says, look, we're not going to ask for this, streamlined congressional process, up or down vote every time. But these are our operational imperatives today, very critical to modernizing government. We're falling behind if we don't get them. Would you be open to these types of mechanisms? Yes, Max, I guess that's the last question with the governor standing. Go ahead, Max. Yeah, and I'll try to be brief. I agree. I mean, it sounds trite, but best practice sharing is so valuable and important. And I know that in the councils that I work on, CFO Council and the other CXO councils, one of our second-term imperatives is to make sure that we're raising our game even more in terms of sharing those best practices and making sure when an agency has a success point, we figure out how it happened, why it happened, how it's translatable. But it's a situation where it takes a lot of different input to get to those best practices more visible to everyone involved. Thank you very much.